So good to you all the time. Thanks.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here this evening. We're so excited to start this series, the Salon de Plume, and incredibly delighted to have Dan O'Brien and Alan Shapiro here with us this evening. So, and I've been saying that, they're Dan and Alan have been our sort of dream team. You know, their work I think speaks together. We were talking a little bit more in the before the program started about some of the ways in which their work speaks to each other. So we're looking forward to talking to them about that a little bit later. But we want to hear them read first, and I guess I should say we'll start with Dan, and I will. I just want to say a few sort of personal words before I read give the official bio. I first became aware of Dan's work when we had some poems that were together and appeared together in war literature and the arts. And so and I think I reached out to you on Facebook and just was following your work because war and writing about war was a particular interest of mine. And I'd been working on a series of poems about a former student of mine who had been blown up by a command-controlled improvised explosive device in Afghanistan. He did survive. So that's when I became familiar with your work, and have really been fascinated too by the sort of that toggling back and forth between your work as a playwright and a poet. So maybe we can talk about that and a little bit more. So, and actually, this is where I promised that I would do a shout out to the Deep Dive podcast. I'm going to do that now because, and so this, for those of you who don't know, Dan's wife, Jessica St. Clair, has a wonderful podcast called the Deep Dive Pod, which she does with June Diane Raphael. But what's interesting is to hear, and in it, Jessica has talked a lot about her cancer experience as well, and you'll hear Dan reading about it from his perspective. This evening, but she described Dan as being very, and I think I kind of laughed at this, but then as being very comfortable as a poet. She didn't even give him cred for being a playwright, but for walking through the underworld, right? Being very comfortable in the realm of the underworld, and I thought, well, maybe that's a little dramatic, but then when I read his manuscript, Our Cancers, again, which he will be reading from tonight, I thought, wow, that was on point. I mean, I was there, and it was just absolutely, to use a word that, I think Alan likes to use a lot, just devastating. So, anyway, with that, I will officially introduce you and then turn the mic over to you so that you can share your work with us. So, Dan O'Brien is a playwright, poet, essayist, and librettist. His play, The House in Scarsdale, a memoir for the stage, was the winner of the 2018 PEN America Award in Drama and was nominated for 6 Los Angeles Drama Critics Circle prizes, including Best Play. The Body of an American is the winner of the Horton Foote Prize for Outstanding New American Play, the inaugural Edward M. Kennedy Prize for Drama, the Penn Center USA Award for Drama, the L. Arnold Weisberger Award, and was shortlisted for the Evening Standard's Charles Winter Award for Most Promising Playwright. That play is based on, and I'm sure he'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's based on O'Brien's friendship with the war photographer Paul Watson, who received the 1994 Pulitzer Prize for the photo he took of that American soldier who was desecrated and being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. Just a really a haunting photo that many say changed the course of the U.S.'s involvement in the mission there. O'Brien is the author of several poetry collections, including War Reporter, New Life, and Scarsdale. His 4th collection, Our Cancers, will be published by Acre Books, that's University of Cincinnati Press, in September. He's also the author of a collection of essays just out called A Story That Happens on Playwriting, Childhood, and Other Traumas, published by CB Editions in the UK. And also a US edition is forthcoming in September from Dalkey Archive Press. So he's got a lot coming out at once in September. He's taught playwriting at Princeton, Sewanee, the University of the South, Sewanee's Writers Conference, I should just say, and the University of the South, and elsewhere. And Dan, I believe you're now on the visiting faculty for the fall at the Goddard College MFA program. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So without further ado, hand it
Thank
over.
you. Wow, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for plugging my wife's podcast. She's funny. She's the comic mask to my tragic mask. So I'll probably be reading some heavy material for a little bit. But if you want something light, tune into her podcast. I'm gonna, I instead of just reading from the new book, I was going to try to read from a few of my collections because of the subject, and because if there's any unifying aspect to my work is that I think I always write about trauma in one form or another, whether it's in poetry or playwriting or essays. So I'm going to read a few poems from a few books, and I'll wrap it up after 10 minutes. And I'll try not to give too much explanation for each poem. These first poems are from my book Scarsdale, which was my second book published, but in many ways is my first book, and like many first books is about a traumatic childhood. And I'll just read a few. This poem is called My Handwriting. Grew small for a time, Puritan, in the black ink I still favor. I felt compelled to rein myself in, believing the sin of pride governed me, a child. I thought large print meant loud voice and affront to God's ears, so I chastened myself to grow smaller while still remaining the great thing I was, still decipherable to myself at least, and if not to me, then to God. I had other sins, of course, and prayers I knew by heart. Or did I dwindle myself down to this thread on the page so my mother would find me and ask, "What's this?" This poem's called God's Brother. We walked home from school. He was older than I was by ages. The hill was a runnel of shade as the great trees discarded their leprous bark down to the pavement, curling and trod into dust. I told him of a boy who'd misbehaved at school again. "What makes you think you're better than him?" he asked. We walked in silence after that, wet leaves under our feet like water. Then, as if to remind us both, he said, "You're not God, you know?" This is a poem entitled A Leaf. He was trembling like one, father said about my brother in the hospital bed, as if surprised at what he'd almost done, giddy too, because he'd have to try it again. So much had changed, or would be changing soon. Was he scared he'd be punished this life or the next? Or was it guilt that made him tremble like a leaf on a high branch of the tall oak outside the window he'd opened to fit his small body through? Forget this was in winter, forget the oak had been evergreen. He fell like an act of truth and beauty spiraling down to the melting snow. Wouldn't it seem a miracle if it had happened at all this way? Those last two poems are from my brother, my older brother. And this is the last poem I'll read from Scarsdale. And it's also for my older brother. It's called The Consolation of Poetry. Otherwise, dear brother, I'd be where you are now, where they've taken away your belt and shoelaces, where all you can do is call home for help. Next, I'm just going to read one poem from my collection, War Reporter. This is what started about 10 years of collaborating with a Pulitzer Prize winning war reporter named Paul Watson, working with him. We've since become friends. I didn't know him when I first started working with him. Most of these poems are derived from recordings of conversations we've had, experiences we've had together going on. You know, half of this collection are poems set in the Canadian Arctic, because that's where I finally met him in person. But this is a poem about what was probably the most traumatic thing in his life, and it's what hooked me in terms of well, it's a poem about his haunting, which haunted me and still does. This is called The War Reporter Paul Watson Hears the Voice. We asked them, have you seen the American soldier? Someone says he saw him tied up in a wheelbarrow. I take a picture of children bouncing on a rotor blade in the smoldering wreckage of a Black Hawk. Has anyone seen the dead American soldier? The mob parts around me. I look down in the street and I meet the man. When you take a picture, the camera covers your face. You shut the rest of the world out. Everything goes dim. And I hear a voice both in my head and out. If you do this, I will own you forever. I'm sorry, but I have to. If you do this, I will own you. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to desecrate your memory. If you do this, I will own you forever. I took his picture while they were beating his body and cheering, some spitting, some kid wearing a chopper crewman's goggles, face screwed up in rapturous glee while giving the dead man the finger. An old man's raising his cane like a club and thudding it down against the dead flesh. Men holding the ropes that bind the dead man's wrists or stretching his arms out over his head, rolling him back and forth in the hammering morning light. I'm standing outside myself. I'm watching someone else take these pictures, wondering, you poor man, who are you? So we may end up talking more about Paul Watson later, but I want to keep moving. I thought I'd read. I'm going to skip. I was going to read a little bit from a play I wrote about him, but I'll read from that if it comes up. I'm going to read from this new collection. It's coming out in September, and I've been calling it for 5 years now a chronicle in poems. It's 101 fragments. The first 50 written during my wife's breast cancer treatment. The next 51 poems written during my treatment for stage 4 colon cancer. I was diagnosed on the day of her last infusion for her breast cancer treatment, her chemotherapy infusion. So our cancer stories, hinged perfectly. And the collection attempts to capture that. So I'm going to read a few of these. And in many ways, the collection is an exercise or an experiment in minimalism. I didn't really set out necessarily to write it that way, but that's the way it came to me. So I'll read a few from that. And they're simply numbered. This is 3. We drove into the deepening blizzard to the bar of an inn where I confessed, you confessed, tabletop votives around us like prayer, then took you home and could have let you go into black trees, blue snow, pale moon, but followed and turned you around with my voice. Then kissing in the brisk capsule of the car, idling beside loose farmyard walls, snowflakes occluding breath, blearing glass, then serpentine the mountainside, slicing swish around harrowing switchbacks along the river unfrozen within, then climbing indiscreet stairs to the tall arc of your spine in the old bed, in the old house, as the cinders nestled in the cast iron stove, wind gasping in the rafters. In the morning, you opened your eyes to the bright, cold room with your wild, wide smile that asks, what's next? This. Early morning, eyes closing, you're whirled away from me into another bright, cold room where they will excise the ember of your disease. You are going where I fear I cannot follow. Noontime, no warning, night falls. Who knows the cause, the crime? 14, mother, oh mother, mother, I call to and from nowhere. 17, the flies hatched in the walls while you slept in the night beside me, while the snow filled fields with peace, while a moose filled winter with his breath, while mice filled our pockets with seeds. The flies multiplied snarling on our walls, so I slaughtered the flies for love. 19, my life shrinks, I will share all with you. 22, she was the mother I preferred. I presumed when he cried for his wife as she lay dying in their parlor, he was crying for himself, his beloved, his children, and not the child I was, bending to whisper goodbye. 52, the surgeon is an amateur composer promising in his windowless examination cell to force my flesh into lattice-like madrigals. This surgeon prescribes caravanning to an oasis copious with palms and ghosts. This surgeon encourages adoring like children again. This surgeon reads the map of my purgation. Let me heal you, he says. See these marks. I instruct you to wash them all away. 54, I blurt your name, vomiting as they plunge the pike into the black bile below. In the dilaudid dream, I am seeing souls slipping down muddy banks to the Styx, reversing, scuffling in the flux mercifully. I am transported to a station like Grand Central Terminal, churning souls, noticing me, noticing them. I wonder, where in the world is everybody going? 59, last night, my love, I longed to reach across to where you lay. I lay beside you, awake in the womb of our common malady. I did not for fear you would feel my fear of losing touch. 83, in the vision, our child is a woman gazing across a cozy table at me, some locale holy to us like Carmel, sometimes sleepy like mid-afternoon in this courtyard with leaves glinting. The season shouldn't matter, but it does matter that I am being looked after with quizzical aggravation and affection. I am certain, I am pleased she contains our features commingling, her hair like her mother's copper curling, like my hair used to, like our elusive conversation foundering on the mundane. Her mother, with any luck, is running late. Our daughter wears a dress of Marian blue, a healer from birth. She is why we are here, simply sharing a meal. And this is just the last, the last poem. 101. There is beauty I may never recover. Nobody can suspend the moment, pedaling my bicycle in pursuit of my wife, on hers with our daughter. As night falls, moon rises, daughter laughs. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was just incredible, and so just to hear you read those sequences from our cancers. And it struck me that how much war has actually really been a part of your life, and how it's between the war reporter and the body of American, your relationship with Paul Watson, I go back to the preface of Our Cancers, if you don't mind, if I just, before I hand it over to Nancy and Alan, if I just read that, the first paragraph. It says on the 14th, so this is the preface to Our Cancers. On the 14th anniversary of 9/11, a catastrophe we witnessed firsthand, our apartment on Water Street, suffused with the World Trade Center's carcinogenic dust, my wife discovered a lump in her breast. 6 months after her double mastectomy, on the day of her final infusion of chemotherapy, I awoke from my colonoscopy procedure to some bad news of my own. My treatment would consist of intensive chemotherapy and 2 major surgeries over the next 9 months. So even, that is just stunning and devastating. In the wake of 9/11, right? Sort of again, the carcinogenic dust and. And I know that you talk about some, we can maybe delve into this a little bit later, but just the, also, and when we talk about cancer, the metaphors that we use in terms of fighting cancer and battling cancer, I think you address that in some of your craft essays. But anyway, thank you so much. And as I turn it over to Nancy, I just want to say, Alan, too, thank you so much for being here. And I owe so much, to you and your generosity as a poet. And I'm incredibly grateful for that. And I'm so delighted to have you here with us this evening. So with that, Nancy.
Good. I could unmute my audio. That's great. That was wonderful, Dan. Amanda had shared your manuscript with me, and as Alan would say, the poems were devastating, and I really was thrilled that you read 3. And I couldn't help but notice the way the stanzas were set up, how they went down the page. It reminded me so much of the Twin Towers. I couldn't, the way they were narrow and set up, and then they followed one after the other, her story, his story. It was very beautiful. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I can't believe people have been through, and you're here and still thriving. I'm thinking of what Alan recently wrote in the tri-quarterly piece what was it called? I just read it this morning. It's so fabulous. But
Space That Sees. Space That Sees.
Oh, yeah, it's wonderful. This conversation with C.K. Williams. And what did he say? You said, how did you write? What, you wrote to the very end, didn't you? How did you do that, sick as you were? What kept you thrashing about? And he says, the mind I wrote with wasn't sick. And so I was thinking about that with both of your poems and manuscripts. The mind wasn't sick during all of this, and certainly isn't now. So thank you so much. So introducing Alan, our next guest poet, essay and translator, the author of numerous poetry collections, among which his Night of the Republic, published by Houghton Mifflin in 2012, was a finalist for the 2013 Griffin Poetry Prize and the National Book Award. University of Chicago Press published his most recent Against Translation in 2019, and Proceed to the Checkout and By are forthcoming in 2022 and 2023, respectively. He is also the author of Self-Forgetful, Perfectly Useless Concentration, Essays on the Craft of Poetry. He's professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he served as a William R. Kennan Jr. Distinguished Professor of Faculty in Creative Writing and longtime and beloved faculty member at the Distinguished Warren Wilson MFA Program for Writers. So he has received numerous, if not most, of the most prestigious awards in poetry, I think, such as the Kingsley Tufts Award, a Los Angeles Times Book Award in Poetry, a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Writers Award, 2 awards from the National Endowment of the Arts, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and to name them all would take the entirety of our Zoom. So we've provided a link to a more extensive biography in the chat. Of his work time, Slay has written, risk-loving swiftness of perception and his affinity for stories that upend convention and taboo have enabled him to reclaim, for poets of my generation, areas of feeling and linguistic virtuosity that originated with William Carlos Williams, Elizabeth Bishop, J.V. Cunningham, and Ivor Winter. It is hard for me to see how an ideal anthologist of the future will be able to include their names without gracefully including his. Although an alumna of Warren Wilson's MFA program, you came aboard the faculty after I graduated. Your reputation as both a wonderful poet and teacher are legendary. So I'm so happy for the opportunity to finally meet you. So let's hear those wonderful poems.
Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate it. And I want to also thank Dan, whose poems, I have to say, are not devastating, they're exhilarating. And they managed to convert a terrible trauma into aesthetic pleasure, which is without falsifying the trauma. And I think that that's really what all great poetry is supposed to do. I want to also say that I am going to read some poems that are chosen for this subject of this conversation, and I don't just write about doom and gloom, though it is a favorite subject, I have to say. Anyway, I'm going to start appropriately enough with a poem called Zoom, since we're on Zoom, and the poem is addressed to my late sister, Beth. She's the you in the poem, and there's also a kind of an allusion, buried allusion to an old television show called Hollywood Squares, which every time I'm on Zoom makes me think that I'm in some kind of underworld version of Hollywood Squares. So anyway, this is called Zoom. In the hospice where you died, a lot of money was spent to make the place conform to someone's algorithm of a home. Shag carpeted lobby, wood paneled elevator, particle board furniture with shrink wrap thin mahogany veneer, faux marble linoleum tiles. There were paintings of chickens in a barnyard on the walls of every room. The homier they made it, the more clinical it felt. You, of course, were out of it by then. The ersatz hominess was for the living, not the almost dead. And in the rare occasions when you woke and tried to talk, I could only hear enough of what you murmured to know how far away you were from anything I knew, alone in a remoteness that today seems almost familiar, though no less remote. Like hospice, you might say, by another name. My face isolated in a square, stacked with the squares of friends and family. Inside the screen-sized square, our separate boxes make together. Boxes talking box to box as in a bar or restaurant face to face, as in a pre-posthumous world of host and game show faces, mummified to pasty smiles of dead celebrities, still quipping, how many balls on a pool table? Depends on how many men are playing pool. I think I hear you in our edgy laughter, as if we'd won a one-way ticket to a last resort, a club meds of an island rendezvous, a hidden, herded horde of eye germs doing anything to keep alive and still be seen and heard. Funny how signing off, no matter who I wave to, it's you I always see wave back at me. The two of us together once again in a lost dimension, as if we're both on ship and shore, stranded, departing, waving till the square goes mute and blackens, and the room with just myself inside it feels so unreal, I'm virtually nowhere where you are. The next one I'm reading Amanda asked me to read this poem. It's just 10 thoughts about the difference between catharsis and trauma. I have had a lifelong kind of argument with Aristotle. I think he'll survive my disagreement with him, but he, about the idea of art as providing a catharsis that sort of liberates us from the feelings that it engages. I've never been released from anything. And I, you know, if art heals in any way, it's only because it feels good while we do it. It's not because it somehow solves something beyond the art in the world. I don't think it does anything like that. So anyway, that's where the kind of manic, you know, sardonic tone of this comes from. It's called 10 Thoughts About Catharsis and Trauma. 1, trauma is the thought balloon around the flickering ellipsis of a text that never comes because it's never ending. On a backlit screen of the mobile device, catharsis thinks it is. 2, all the options to undo, repeat, clear, select all, paste, find, and copy always appear on the edit menu of the new document page. Catharsis promises to trauma, but only as washed out autistic apparitions which don't change or move when clicked on. 3, catharsis mistakes a belly flop for a swan dive into a tar pit. Trauma butterflies across. 4, over and over, trauma turns to the bottle that for catharsis is a draft of Aristotle. 5, guess who says my mantra's mojo, dojo's MO is release? 6, guess who hears release? 7, the reward center of the subject's brain lights up at random intervals, but only frequently enough to keep the flickering, ever just about to be extinguished hope from ever quite going out. Catharsis is the tag, the like, the post or comment, the cryptic message out of the blue on trauma's Facebook page. So trauma, just as it's about to, can't stop scrolling for any passing mention of its name. 8, in the middle of an orgasm, the mangled faces of trauma and catharsis can't be told apart except for the eyes, the shocked, wide open, not you again eyes of the one staring straight up into the squeezed shut, see no evil eyes of the other. 9, trauma is a germ, a fungus, impervious to medication in the prone Panglossian body of catharsis, proliferating even posthumously until everything tests positive. Walls, bed, doors, curtains, phone, sink, soap, poles, pump, window shades, ceiling and floor, tiles that need now to be ripped out and replaced in this best of all possible rooms. 10, up through collapsed, turned inside out interiors, broken architraves and shattered windows, the 3-dog night ringtone of a cell phone in a pinned hand goes on singing joy to the world. And despite themselves, all the boys and girls are singing too, the fishes in the deep blue sea, and you and me, they sing and won't stop singing just as long as nobody, not trauma or catharsis, ever picks up. This poem is called Flying Eastward from my brother's funeral. My brother died in Los Angeles of brain cancer in 1999. And the title is an allusion to John Donne's poem, Riding Westward on Easter Sunday. And so it's, in a way, there's one little line of Dunn's that's quoted, which is present yet unto my memory. Other than that, you know, it's a kind of implicit sort of argument with that poem. It's called Flying Eastward from My Brother's Funeral. When we reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign went off, a child, a little girl, went running up and down the aisle, pointing to the windows as she shouted, "It's flying out there. Everything is flying." And she was right. The flying was all outside, out among the clouds that passed us, while inside, everything was still, except for the girl. Inside was where you sat, or walked, or ran, as though on just another kind of ground. And when we flew through time zones later than the ones we left, I noticed how the blue sky, even as we were flying through it, was always somewhere else. Even at an altitude of 40,000 feet, was just as far away as on the ground. It was still just air to be seen through, to the blue it turned into without my seeing how. And frightening me even more, when I looked down, it seemed as if the land and the scattered clouds below us, not us, were moving, while we hung helplessly in place in a kind of limbo, watching them slide under the plane at a snail's pace in the opposite direction, in a continuous inch by inch, left to right procession, as if all motion could only now be westward, back behind us where we started from. What's present yet unto my memory, before the black suits came, after the last breath, the way the lit up empty stadium out the bedroom window radiated a dull corona, paling up into a sky so black I couldn't tell if it was late or early. And then a plane flew over it, descending in my direction. And I'm thinking now, if someone had been looking out the window, down at the accelerating streetlights, hurrying eastward, faster and faster, just as the landing gear rumbled open and braced for impact, he would have seen my dim lit vigil rising toward him and then rush away beneath him before the plane touched down. I'm gonna finish with a lighter poem. It's about as light as I get, but it's just about imagining the afterlife all of us are gonna have on the cell phones of other people. So it's called Postscript. When I arrive at the final off-grid to meet my ultimate decoder, I'll be picturing my afterlife inside your phone, hanging by a thread of soon-to-be deleted texts. I'll be thinking how I'll still be saying in a forgotten or never opened voicemail that you someday just might click on by mistake. "Hey babe, it's just me calling. I'll try again, at least until your box is full." All of my Facebook postings on your page will be sinking ever deeper under the compost of newer postings, becoming, soon as posted, older postings, till an algorithm for the anniversary of some rare and special moment we had posted resurrects me so I can be reburied and continue sinking even deeper till a newer, faster platform comes along. I'll be the caller that your phone in the snug dark of your purse or pocket, while it mutes the ringing so you'll never know it's me, is programmed to rename unknown, persisting only as red numbers of missed calls on an endless list of zero contact, where in no time, sooner or later, we will finally meet. Thanks. Nancy, you got to unmute yourself.
Sorry, just talking away here. Those were absolutely fabulous. I enjoyed them so much. And I'm thinking, there's so much, you're always able to integrate humor into your poems in a way that I've really never seen anyone else do. I think it's interesting, this kind of inclusive consciousness about your poems to, the every aspect. I can't help it, looking at this wonderful essay. You all have to read it. I think maybe it's not an essay, actually, it's a
Dialogue.
fiction kind dialogue.
Imaginary dialogue. Yeah.
Yes, imaginary or maybe not, right? Because you make it so believable. But I think I love this part, and I think Trish is putting a link in the chat for this. But it's so interesting how Charlie talks about CK. It talks about how always what is the joy of it all, and he says just to be, I'm paraphrasing here, but just to be alert and conscious and noticing and aware of nuances, and even the nuances as things fall apart, as things fall into ruin. So I guess I see the same kind of quality in your poems. So they were very uplifting, actually. Here we're talking about trauma, and actually they were very uplifting. So I have a question for both of you. I'm thinking, you talked about, and I agree with you about, I don't think poetry is cathartic, and if it's not meant to be cathartic, and maybe it's meant to sort of find another way for the subject to exist, or another form for it. And probably with trauma, because you both have written about it in so many different forms. It's such a, it's such a complex subject. It seems like it's always trying to find a way to articulate itself through prose or poem or memoir. But I'm wondering, though, if what does writing about trauma actually do? Doesn't fix the problem at all, but does it transform trauma into something else, or it gives it more room and more space and more nuance and more being? So that's a question for both of you.
Dan, you go first, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, my initial response is to bring up what is often considered a bad word in literary circles, which is the idea of therapeutic writing. Writing saved me as a kid. Being able to write and in poetic form and teenage poetic form, to be able to write the truth of the trauma that I was experiencing and my family was experiencing. Of course, Alan's absolutely right. It didn't necessarily change anything in terms of the circumstances of my trauma. And that's been true, with the cancer experience as well. But it did help me a great deal psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. And, I still have that belief or that feeling that, whatever the writer, some degree of what the writer experiences in creating is going to be experienced by the reader, by the audience. And so what is helpful in some way about the poem that orders the chaos of trauma, what's helpful to the writer, by extension, can be hopefully helpful to some degree, maybe to a small degree, maybe for, those few moments that the poem's being read, or, or maybe for 20 minutes afterwards, it can still be helpful. It can still, the writer I found at the age of 13, 14 was Anne Sexton. Growing up in suburban Scarsdale, New York, suddenly I found these poems that were, howling with the truth of trauma that was not allowed to have a voice in any other way except in the poetry. And so that's the most intense experiences in my life have always driven me to poetry first. They've often, the subject or the material may work its way out into a play, and may work its way out into essays, but it almost always needs to first speak as a poem, So, I'm ambivalent about that question of, what does it do? I think it's, it's helpful to the degree that friendship is helpful, that witnessing and bearing witness to each other's struggles are helpful. But maybe that's it, and maybe that's enough. I don't know.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a little different, but in a complementary way. Writing is a way of being happy, even if what you're writing about is how unhappy you are, because you convert something that you off the page you had to passively suffer into something that on the page you can actively make. And so in that sense, it has a kind of therapeutic value because it gives you, even if it's just an illusion, it gives you an illusion of agency, and that's better than not having any agency at all. It's where I guess I would at least be a little bit more skeptical is, I heard Reynolds Price, the great novelist, give a talk about how poetry, and not his novels, but poetry, cured him of cancer. And that was what he said this in a big at a conference about medical narratives, and I sort of raised my hand after he said that, and I said, so the chemotherapy and the radiation and the operation that you had to remove the tumor from your spine, that really had nothing to do with your recovery. And it just seemed so sentimental to me. And I there's no, as what you just said, Dan, that I love the connection that you made between poetry and friendship, because I think that that's exactly what it is that it makes you feel part of a community. It brings you out of if you think of the pain, whether it's emotional pain or it's physical pain, which drives you back into your body, away from language, away from other people, away from family. So you're nothing but just a suffering creature. Writing is a way of reversing that arc and coming out of the body back into language, back into a community, back into a relationship with other people. And so in that sense, yeah, it's good. It's, it's what we do, and I think that there's something affirmative, whether that's, therapeutic, I don't know, but I think there's something affirmative about making art, making something beautiful, something right out of something wrong, in such a way that honors the intractable wrongness of the thing you're representing. And that's what, and so I would like to, one of the things that I found so interesting about your book, Dan, the new one, and I read the War Reporter. I think I had a jacket comment.
You wrote a blurb for it very kindly.
Yeah. That there's two things going on in this new work that are sort of counterintuitive and or you would think are incompatible. You wrote in long lines in the War Reporter. Those are all long lines, and these are like, you need to see the poems on the page in order to appreciate what's the psychological emotional dynamic. I don't think the voice alone can communicate that. You have to see they're in short lines, they're in stanzas, they're tightly orchestrated. On the one hand, there's no punctuation at all, and so there's a sense in which you are totally abandoning yourself to a kind of chaos of feeling, or honoring that, and at the same time, trying to show what part of you wants to give order to it by having those stanzas and those, and even if it's just the only vestige of punctuation is the capitalization at the beginning of sentences, but otherwise There's nothing. So you've got so many places in those poems where phrases are squinted between syntactical connections. Like it could, you don't know whether what you've just said goes backwards or whether it goes forward. And then you realize, oh, it has to be something that you can't know and resolve on the move. And it mimics, I think, that sense of helplessness and that sense of being at the mercy of things you can't control. But the need to control is visibly everywhere, on the page. And the way it's just divided between 50 poems about your wife's cancer, 50, or 51 about her, and 50 about you. And then there's other aspects about it. Like one other thing I just want to say about those poems that I found so interesting is that, particularly in the first half, there's very little metaphor. There's not that there isn't metaphor. What there is instead of metaphor is metonymy, is this focus on things and literal things that are worked into either through juxtaposition or through, or just in the placement, get invested with metaphorical meaning, but they are the flies in the wall, right? The flies in the wall versus, and the spider. There's spider webs, and they're two very different images that are sort of in tension with each other, because the fly is just simply, carrion feeder, but the spider weaving the web is the poet trying to weave this thing, together. And it just, and it was only toward the end that you actually turn the web into a metaphor, because up to that point, it's just a thing, it's just there. So the metaphors come out of the literal circumstances of the experience. You're not importing stuff from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was also like an incredibly, artful, and I bet, I don't know, maybe it was just an intuitive thing, but it was something that I think I don't know, as I'm reading it, I was thinking, I have to honor this experience. I can't prettify it. I'm not going to, turn it into metaphors. And if the metaphors are going to come, they're going to come out of the experience itself. I'm not going to somehow, bring them in, import them in from some poetry place,
I mean, that's so generous and I feel accurate, in terms of at least the experience of writing it for me was, very much in one hand, the chaos of the experience that we were living through and hoping to live through, while at the same time trying to use whatever tools I had to find meaning, to make meaning, which for me, in this case, would be to make a poem. As rough drafts, they really came largely as these half-conscious fragments, and I wanted to sort of honor that too. And I wanted to, from the beginning, it was going to be, some of these poems individually would not communicate much, maybe, to anybody. You needed to sort of see the whole piece together to get a feel for the story, for lack of a better word. But the focus on things for me connects to trauma. Do you know what I mean? It's how I approached writing about Paul Watson, partly by seeing how he dealt with his trauma, and how I remember seeing him speak. He's the war reporter again. He was speaking and talking about the day he took that picture in Mogadishu, and he was miming advancing the camera, the film on his camera. And he was, and that triggered a flashback essentially to that moment. So that the object of the camera and his finger on and so for me, and maybe this is also a playwright's impulse, that object, if it's framed right, to some degree, if it's described right, could it evoke for the reader that same intensity of association, And I thought about it a lot during the pandemic, and I've heard lots of people talk about this too. Other poets saying, especially during the height of the pandemic, maybe a year ago, saying, well, I can't write it. I don't want to write metaphor. Yeah. I don't want to hide behind a symbol. If I'm going to, I don't know, maybe some people were saying, I don't want to write about this. I don't know how to write about it. Or they just wanted to almost create something of, plain speech, something, because the reality was so heightened the reality of experience was so heightened. It was the reverse of what is sometimes the poetic impulse, which is to find something that we're overlooking and show how it's important. You know, when you're in the midst of trauma, you know, often you're right up against what is almost hyper real about your life and hyper meaningful.
You know, Dan, the sense that I had, you know, reading our cancers, just you talk about the lineation, and it is really striking to see them on the page. And Alan, you rightfully pointed out that, you know, the difference in lineation from his other works. And actually, you know, the manuscript that you're working on now, Dan, I think is primarily, if not all, prose poems. So, but it was as if, you know, we could only get, you know, that you could only look at that pain and that suffering in little sort of bits and pieces at a particular time, right? And kind of like meet it out. That was the sense that I had reading it. But yeah, to see it on the page is important, just with, you know, set kind of and against that white space, that's the sterile white space, was incredibly striking. And I want to.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, in some ways, you know, I just wanted to also suggest, even though I'm talking too much now, how the trauma leaves you speechless. You know, that there's a lack of language at first, I think. I mean, I sort of had I had a lack of language at first when we were really in the midst of the trauma. And so that's partly why I was feeling this unconscious need to write these poems that were, again, all about shards and fragments and, you know, minimalism.
The thing about minimalism in this particular instance is that it acknowledges that no matter how inclusive you are about this experience, most of it is not going to be amenable to articulation. And you know, you express what you can, and you express what you can in a way that acknowledges that it's very little of what actually had happened. It's a selection and an arrangement and an ordering. And so it's a transformation, yes, but it's a transformation that is also, you know, acknowledges, and this is, again, maybe where we part company, but this is what I found so moving about the poems and about minimalism in this particular case. It acknowledges the inadequacy of what it is you can say, that there's something much larger that you can't get at. Doesn't mean that what you can say is not valuable and not necessary.
But Alan, I couldn't help but think of when you were describing Dan's poems and how they were fragments in this shape. It's almost like it's a thing in the room that you have to feel your way around the dimensions of before you can start naming it. That's what I felt with both of your poems and both of your manuscripts. It's like, it's this, but it is here. It is absolutely here, but I can only feel my way around it and see how much space it takes up. So Amanda, did you have a question? One more question, or do we have time for that? I think someone, Amanda?
No, I wonder if the two of you would, and I know we're kind of running a little bit over here, but this is such a wonderful conversation. I'm wondering about how, and like Dan, maybe with your playwriting, how this is maybe more of a process question. I know, Alan, you'll say, well, there is no process, right? it is, but I don't know how things, you know, do they come to you think, okay, this is play, or this is poem, or you know, and you both have incredible variations with your lineation in terms of length, and you're able to do so many different things. I admire that so much about the both of you, and think that's why your work part of why your work speaks to each other so well.
Yeah, I usually just have an impulse of a direction, you know, in terms of what might be called genre. That, you know, implicit or you know, what I hope is implicit is that I also don't necessarily know what a poem is or should be, or what a play is or should be. but I do have a sense of like, oh, this is going to be something performed for an audience, or this is going to be something that's on the page. You know, for me, poetry is a very private, intimate experience to write and also hopefully to share. So that's part of it too. And you know, and prose, it's interesting. This is connected to a question I had for Alan, which is just that question of how writing about trauma changes over time. You know, whether, because I know I come back to some things that happened 30 years ago and I'm sick of writing about it, but I still have to, or feel I have to. And I wonder if I'm writing about it differently. And I think sometimes I am, and sometimes I'm not. But I'm just curious about you, because I've read your work for a long time, and to see some stories, not stories, these experiences transformed.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So I don't know if that's really a question, but.
Well, I think in a way it's like a question about memories. You know, our memories are, you know, aren't simply something that we recall. They're also something that we construct and create. And they change as our life changes and as they get overlaid with new experiences. And so, you know, I still, you know, I had the same, you know, feeling like, you know, family. Look, you know, one of the things, you know, for me, I write about my family. I'm not a family guy. I mean, I have two children and I'm very close with them and I love them, but what I went through, when I wrote about my sister's death, when I wrote about my brother's death, my parents had died, when I wrote about all of those things, I wrote about them in one way 20 years ago. And now when I come back to them, as I sometimes do, it's at a more abstract level. It's not grounded so much in actual narrative detail. It almost is now they've been kind of transmuted to kind of fable and dream, and things that almost, you know, happened to somebody else or someone that but I'm still related to the person it happened to, but I'm not the same person. But this is where I come back to, again, the stuff about trauma. Is I have been damaged. I mean, listen, I'm a happy person. I've spent life living on my own terms for the most part. I've been married 3 times. I've had, buried a whole lot of friends and family, but the kind of caretaking or the kind of involvement, for me anyway, personally, that I had to sort of do for many years, both with my sister and to some extent with my brother, and then entirely with my parents, damaged me. I mean, it's like a skill that I have gotten worse at the more I had to do it. And so, I've written about this because in some ways I've never been able to leave the house that I was raised in. I'm still stuck there. I keep seeing it in different ways, but I have never been able to somehow get on with things. And so, it's like emotional scar tissue, just not as flexible as I might've been when I was younger. And here's another thing I was thinking about when you were talking, Dan, is that one of the things that I think, another way for me of putting it, like what writing about difficult experiences, and let's face it, we don't have any corner on the difficult experience market. It happens to everybody sooner or later. There's nothing, nobody gets out of life without trauma, nobody, and nobody gets into life without trauma. And but I think that I think that if I don't know, I think I've lost the thread of that. I think that I can't remember what I was going to say. And anyway, I think that you have to, that writing about things teaches you not how to get beyond them, but how to get inside them and how to live with them and how to make it part of who you are, rather than the American metaphor is, well, let's move on, let's move out to the Western territories, let's leave it behind us. No, writing about it is a way of making it part of and for good or ill, making it part of who you are and how you relate to others.
That's so, I think that's really, that's on point. And and just like it's one thing to sort of get through the particular crisis or the trauma, right? And then but living in the aftermath of it and having to deal with that. And it's often, I found that it's not, the immediate it's not the immediate aftermath, it's the year later, it's the 2 years later, it's
Exactly. That's the hard time, right?
people expecting you. It's sort of the double-edged sword of like life goes on, but life goes on, and people expect you. And Jessica is actually and has talked about this too, that sort of it is a kind of PTSD, right?
Yeah.
And
it's also in Dan's book, one of the most powerful, well, not the most, but one of the really amazing poems in both, and they anchor, there's one in the first half and there's one in the second. It's how it changes your relationship with friends and how oppressive their sympathy is and their concern for you, and that you're no longer who you were, and that becomes another, even the gestures of care become a burden. And those are the things that we're not supposed to say, that we're not supposed to acknowledge that. And that's what good writing does, is it gives us the unofficial view from the inside of what it's actually like, so that when other people read it and they, when I can imagine, and in fact, I'd already resonated with me, the burden, the oppressive burden of people feeling sorry for you, which nobody writes about that. But that's a really important part of both of those sections in your book. So that's
I feel maybe it's not an original thought, but the trauma does a lot of things. And one thing it does is it kind of obliterates your identity.
Absolutely.
Who you think you are, at least for a certain amount of time, and that what you could call a recovery or healing or whatever. But that's a process of reimagining. Yeah. Reconstructing who you are. And I think, and I relate everything we're saying to what we're going through culturally and societally right now. There's so much so much sort of larger global or cultural pressure to get back to normal. Exactly. In a way that is kind of psychotic. And will only lead to, I think, not just personal problems, but some cultural problems. So yeah, but I'm glad you connected to that, Alan, because that was a big point of the experience that I'm still going through, was to suddenly feel like, and I think I wrote in one of my essays, I'd never been in the hospital before, and then suddenly at the age of 42 with a 1-year-old daughter, wow, stage 4 cancer, Yeah. While your wife is already being treated, it was a real sense of not only your life is not going to be what you thought, you're no longer what you thought it was, but you are no longer who you thought you were,
So true.
And I will say that the writing again has been helpful, in terms of, reconstructing a sense of who I am, whether or not that's, that's going to continue to change. I don't think any of us, the moment you're done changing, you're done in general. So,
but no, there's no question about that, Dan. I mean, the fact is that like here, writing is a way of consolidating your identity. I was a writer before I got sick. Now I'm a sick person. If I keep writing, then I at least maintain some connection with the person I was before I got sick. And I'm incorporating the sickness into the person that I was before. Like I hit the trifecta when my brother died. I got divorced, and then I had to move. So I moving, divorce, and death, the three things, And when I got so-called unsettled in my new place, I thought, okay, I'd always been somebody's brother, and now I'm nobody's brother. I'd always been somebody's child, and now that my parents are getting older, I'm soon to be nobody's child. For the previous 16 years, I've been somebody's husband, and now I'm nobody's husband. So I had to ask myself, what am I? Bill, and I was a father, so that was important. That was an important thing to affirm and to embrace. I was a basketball player, so I kept playing basketball, and I was a writer, and I kept writing. And that was a
But
way.
did it make you, you must have felt on some level that what you were writing in the heat of that transition, did you feel like it was affecting the form that your writing was
Yes.
taking?
Oh, yeah, no, well, that's a whole nother conversation. It totally did. It totally did. I mean, like I was writing, when I wrote this book about my brother, many of the poems are in blank verse, but I broke the lines because I'm trying to sort of, channel the elegiac tradition of great English poetry, right? But because it seemed so insufficient for what I wanted to do, I had to define myself against it. So I was breaking the line. The lines were just like all over the page. So it was both an attempt to sort of assert a continuity and then recognize the inappropriateness of it and break it at the same time. So I had both of those things. It totally affected everything.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I think I jump in here because I think we had I think Jay, you had a question or your hand was up, and maybe we can end with this and wrap up with your question.
A bit of a burden. I don't think it's quite at the level of the dialogue so far, but I was just going to ask Alan in the notion of poetry as therapy or not as therapy. I understand chemotherapy is kind of a high bar in this context, but what about, this is kind of almost absurd, but I think you'll understand what I'm saying, Alan. What about poetry as a therapy dog?
That's actually really beautiful, I think. That's actually
Someone needs to
really,
write that poem.
Yeah,
Dog.
I don't mean to sort of minimize anything or that Dan had said, but the connection, the sense of having another creature there that's demanding nothing from you, but that you touch them and love them. What could be bad about that? For sure. I think that's a really beautiful. I never would have occurred to me. And I can show you. There's my dog. I don't know if you can see him.
Sammy.
Sammy. Yep. There's Sammy. But I'm a big dog person. But yeah. I mean, in fact, I couldn't have gotten through the pandemic without him.
Or without therapy, or without poetry, probably.
Well, that's what exactly right. I wrote an enormous amount and read an enormous amount, and and I had my dog, and for good or ill, that was enough.
So we've kind of come around full circle here, right? And come to the conclusion that what is writing about trauma do, and poetry, poetry as well. It becomes a therapy dog, right? So,
yeah, that's
I love that. I think we should probably turn it back over to Danny to wrap up at this point. But I wanted to thank you both for just such wonderful conversation and reading. It's just so intellectually stimulating, and I'm so grateful to both of you for that, and to the audience for being here. And also another shout out to Trish Marshall, our fellow Wally, who's been handling the tech for us, and she's just a remarkable human being. So thank you, and to my co-host Nancy. So Danny,
Thank you so much.
have I left anything out?
No, Danny.
All right, Danny, you're on.
I just, brilliant conversation, brilliant reading. I wish this could go on and on. Alan, I was thinking as you read your poem, Zoom, the associative power of just listening to people read. I was at, you were talking about the grid. I happened to be at a mausoleum a couple of days ago on an overcast day, and as you know, they're set out in grids, and the name is written on, engraved in the polished granite, usually. And of course, in each square, one can only see one's own image. And it was overcast, as I said. And then as I moved through the little building, or the outside of the building, the sun happened to come out, through a cloud for a moment, and I found myself partly obscured, but also that the world had come alive in a way that it hadn't just a moment before. And that's what this Zoom was like for me. So I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful.
It's lovely.
Danny, this has just been a terrific evening, and Danny, that was wonderful. That's exactly how it felt. And gosh, we could go on and on. And Dan, I was thinking about something you said before everyone came on, and Amanda mentioned something about astrology, and you said you're agnostic. And I was wondering, like, if you're agnostic. Now, this is for another conversation. We'll have to do a whole nother Zoom on this. But if you're agnostic, can you be spiritual? That's just, well, I'll just throw it out there for later. But
Yeah.
just,
Absolutely. The answer is yes.
Yeah, the short answer sounds like, yeah. Thank you everybody for letting me be a part of this. And
Thank you, Dan. It was nice to meet you.
Alan, you're so generous and brilliant as always. And I'm really grateful, and thank you for everyone who came and listened and were part of this.
Same here. God bless everybody. Love
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
thanks so much, everyone. Okay.
night.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.